Deep in the hinterland of Sweden, where the harsh earth swallows footsteps and the silence weighs like lead, a solitary farmer rides along the forgotten borders of his own property. He is looking for nothing. For years, he has been looking for nothing. But on that afternoon, when the sun was already hanging toward the horizon and the golden light painted everything with farewell, he saw something that made his horse stop before he even pulled the reins. A pregnant young woman, all alone, inside an abandoned shed, the existence of which he did not even remember. And in that instant, without knowing her name, without knowing where she came from, Callie felt the weight of all the years he had wasted. Because God sometimes does not send an answer, he sends a person. If you believe that it is never too late to start over, subscribe to the channel and turn on the little bell. This story will touch your heart in a way you do not expect. At the end of the 19th century, in the isolated regions of Sweden, stories like this were common. There are estates that thrive and estates that wither, and there are those that stand still in time, as if the earth had decided to wait for something that no one knows what it is. The estate of Callie Sjoberg was of this third type, a vast property with pastures extending as far as the eye could see, surrounded by low hills covered in Nordic underbrush and crossed by a stream that during the rainy seasons and snow melts swelled and sang a beautiful melody, but which at that time of year barely had the strength to wet the feet of those who crossed it. The manor house was large, built of stone and sturdy timber by Callie's father decades earlier, with a wide porch, a roof of red clay tiles, and a courtyard where grain used to be dried in the past, but the grandeur of the house only magnified the emptiness that dwelled inside it. Callie was 38 years old and had lived alone in that immensity for far too long. He was not an ugly man. He had a wind-burned face, a thick dark beard, and the rough hands of someone who had known the handle of a hoe since childhood. He always wore the same white cotton shirt under a brown vest worn out at the elbows, and he carried a felt hat that he removed from his head when speaking to someone, because his father had taught him that a polite man uncovers his head before another human being, but so much time had passed since he had taken his hat off for anyone that the gesture was by now almost forgotten. Callie lived between the house, the fields, and the silence. He had a bay horse named Norden, who was more of a companion to him than any person left in his life, and an old farmhand named Taj, who took care of the little livestock that still grazed on those lands, and who from time to time showed up on the porch to drink coffee and drop a few phrases that hurt the most. Well, Tage was nearly 60 years old. He was as thin as a bundle of twigs and possessed the kind of wisdom that does not come from books, but from having taken enough slaps from life to understand how it works. He had worked on the estate since the days of old Sjoberg, Callie's father, and had seen the boy grow up, marry, have a daughter, lose his wife, and close himself off to the world the way one locks a door and throws the key into the river. Tage did not judge, but he didn't pretend everything was fine either. When Callie went days without saying a word, Tage would simply show up, sit on the porch, drink his coffee, and say things like, "A horse that stands still too long in the same place ends up sinking under its own weight." Callie would listen, he wouldn't answer, and Tage would leave without waiting for a response because he knew that certain seeds need time to sprout. The truth about Callie was a truth he carried on himself as if it were a stone tied around his neck. He had been married. His wife's name was Ingrid, and she was the kind of person who made the air lighter when she entered a room. They had married when he was 22 and she was 19 in a simple ceremony in the little church of the nearest village, with the scent of wildflowers and promises that both believed would last forever, and for a while, they did. Ingrid brought life into that estate. She planted flowers on the porch, she sang while she cooked, and when Viola was born the following winter, the whole house seemed to breathe differently, as if it had finally found its reason for existing. Viola was petite, she had her mother's big eyes and her father's quiet temperament, and Callie, when he held her in his arms for the first time, felt a kind of love he didn't know existed. A love that hurt from how big it was, that squeezed his chest from how beautiful it was. But God, who gives with one hand, sometimes takes with the other, and anyone who lives in the countryside knows it is useless to ask why. When Viola was 3 years old, a fever took over the region. It wasn't something a doctor knew how to cure, because a doctor in that remote corner of the world was a luxury few knew. Ingrid fell ill on a Tuesday and died the following Sunday, so fast that Callie didn't even have time to understand what was happening. One day, she was there, smiling, fixing Viola's hair, and the next, she was lying in bed with her eyes closed and her skin so hot it burned anyone who touched her. Callie did everything he could. He brought water from the stream, prepared infusions that the women of the neighborhood had taught him. He stayed awake for entire nights, holding her hand and begging God not to take away the only thing that gave his life meaning. God did not listen. Ingrid was buried under a large golden chain tree that she herself had planted in the first year of their marriage. Callie dug the grave with his own hands because he didn't want anyone else to touch that earth that would guard his wife's body. And when he threw the last shovel of dirt and stood there looking at that mound of fresh earth, something inside him broke in a way that had no repair. It wasn't a noisy break, it was silent, deep, like when a thick root snaps underground and no one sees it, but the entire tree slowly begins to die. In the months that followed, Callie continued to function because the estate needed someone and Viola needed a father, but function was the right word because he was not living. He was repeating gestures, carrying out tasks, existing on autopilot, while inside it was all darkness. Viola grew, and the more she grew, the more she resembled Ingrid. The same eyes, the same way of tilting her head when listening to something attentively. And every time Callie looked at his daughter, he saw the woman he had lost, and the pain was so great that he began to do the most cowardly thing a father could do. He began to distance himself, not all at once. Not on purpose, it was little by little, like someone loosening a rope without noticing. First, it was the hugs that became rarer. Then it was the conversations that grew shorter. Then it was the nights he stayed on the porch staring at nothingness, while Viola slept alone in the room that Ingrid had decorated with so much affection. Tage noticed it, the women in the neighborhood noticed it, even Viola, though small, noticed that her father was there, but at the same time he wasn't, that his body occupied space, but his heart had gone to a place she couldn't reach. When Viola turned 7, Ingrid's mother showed up at the estate. Fru Lovisa was a strong woman with calloused hands and a resolute heart, who lived in the county seat and who had never approved of the life her daughter had led in the countryside. She arrived with a proposal that was more of a sentence. She said that Viola needed a school, to be among people, to have a woman who would care for her like a mother, because Callie, with all due respect, couldn't handle it, and the worst part was that she was right. Callie knew she was right. He saw his daughter playing alone in the courtyard, talking to the chickens because there was no one her age to talk to, and he knew that that little girl deserved more than a father who could barely look at her without feeling the world crashing down on him. So he let Viola go. He didn't fight, he didn't beg, he simply stood still on the porch as Fru Lovisa's carriage took his daughter away along the dirt road, and Viola looked back through the window with those enormous eyes that were identical to her mother's. And Callie felt that he was dying for the second time. After that, the years passed as years pass for those who have no reason to count them. Callie worked the land, tended the cattle, kept the estate standing more out of habit than will. Tage stayed because Tage was the kind of person who doesn't abandon anyone, not even when the person wants to be abandoned. The estate began to shrink, not in size, but in life. Rooms were closed off. The porch, where Ingrid used to put flowers, remained bare. And Viola's room, that little bedroom with lace curtains and a wooden crib that Callie had built with his own hands, was locked. No one went in there, no one touched anything. It was like a sanctuary of guilt, a place where Callie locked away everything he didn't have the courage to face. He never wrote to Viola, never sent messages, never went to visit her, because every time he thought of doing so, the shame was greater than the longing. And the shame of a father who has failed is perhaps the heaviest thing that exists in this world. Tage tried every now and then. He would show up with paper and ink, leave them on the kitchen table, and say that he had leftover supplies down in the storeroom, that he wouldn't use them, that they could stay there. Callie would look at the paper, look at the ink, and then put everything away in a drawer that slowly filled with blank sheets and words that were never written. Tage didn't insist. He only kept that look that said everything without saying anything and returned to the barn. It was on an October afternoon when the cold was biting and the earth was so dry it cracked into patterns that looked like maps to nowhere, that Callie decided to ride to the far end of the property. There wasn't a special reason. He did it from time to time, more to pass the time than out of necessity. Norden walked slowly with that gentle pace of a horse that knows the route, and Callie rode with distant thoughts, so distant that he almost didn't notice he had arrived near the old tenant farmer's shed located on the eastern border of the estate. The shed had been there for decades, built in his father's time to house seasonal workers. No one had used it for years. The roof had half collapsed, the walls of stone and mud had holes, and weeds had grown all around, as if trying to swallow the entire building. Callie was about to ride straight past when he saw the clothes. It wasn't much. A washed dress and a pale cloth hanging on a piece of iron wire tied between two wooden posts next to the shed. The kind of improvised clothesline made only by someone living in a place, because no one hangs clothes where they don't intend to stay. Callie stopped Norden and stood looking for a while, trying to understand. Then he slowly dismounted, tied the horse to a post, and walked toward the shed's door. The door was ajar. Not locked, he pushed it carefully, took off his hat out of instinct, and what he saw inside made the ground vanish beneath his feet. It was a young woman. She couldn't have been much older than 20. She was sitting on the packed dirt floor, leaning against the wall with a thin blanket over her legs. She wore a faded blue cotton dress full of men's, and her dark hair was gathered in a loose bun that let strands escape over her thin face. Her feet were bare and dirty with dust, and she was pregnant, very pregnant. Her round belly stood out against the thin fabric of the dress, and she held it with both hands, like someone clutching the most precious thing in the world and at the same time the heaviest. When she saw Callie at the door, her eyes widened in a way he knew well: fear. Pure fear, the kind that makes the whole body stiffen, that locks the legs, accelerates the heart, and makes a person calculate in seconds whether it's possible to escape or if it's better to stay completely still and hope not to get hurt. She curled up against the wall, covering her belly with her arms, as if to protect what was inside from whatever threat that unknown man might represent. Callie felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt for years. It wasn't pity, it was something deeper, older, as if a part of him that had been asleep had suddenly been shaken. He raised both hands slowly, showing he carried nothing. He stayed completely still in the doorway, without advancing a single step, and spoke with the calmest voice he could find. That voice he used, with a frightened horse, with a hunted animal, with any creature that needed to understand it, wasn't in danger. He said his name was Callie, that this land was his, but that she didn't have to be afraid, that he wouldn't do her any harm. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him with those dark eyes that were both young and far too old, eyes that had already seen things no one that age should have to see. Callie felt that every word he would say would be weighed, measured, and judged by someone who had learned in the worst possible way that a man's words don't always mean something. He looked around the shed. He saw a torn blanket in the corner, saw a rolled-up rag serving as a pillow, saw leftovers of oatmeal porridge on a tin plate, saw the entire precariousness of that existence, and felt something resembling anger. But it wasn't anger toward her. It was anger toward the world that allowed a pregnant girl to live like that, alone, in a hole in the middle of nowhere. He spoke again, still standing in the doorway, still with his hat in his hand. He said he had a big house nearby with an extra room, food, and clean water. He said she could go there, that she didn't need to stay in that shed that could barely stand upright. He said he wanted nothing in return, that it was just an offer of a better roof for her and the child that was about to arrive. The girl finally spoke. Her voice came out low, hoarse, as if her vocal cords were rusted from not being used for too long. She said only 3 words: "I don't want to." And there was so much in those 3 words. There was history, there was pain, there was a wall built brick by brick with every disappointment, every lie, every hand that had been extended to offer help only to ask a price she didn't want to pay. Callie understood. He didn't understand the details because he knew nothing about her, but he understood the feeling because he himself had built similar walls. He nodded, slowly put his hat back on, looked one more time at her belly, felt that tightness in his chest increase, and left. He mounted Norden and rode back to the estate without looking back. But that night, for the first time in years, Callie couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that girl, those eyes, that belly, that "I don't want to," that sounded like a scream disguised as a whisper. And he thought of Viola. He thought of how he had let his own daughter go without fighting, He thought of how he had closed her room, locked the door, and pretended that that solved anything. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, God had placed that girl in that shed, not by chance, but as a question Callie needed to answer. The following morning, before the sun rose, Callie filled a basket with what he had: flour, potatoes, a piece of salted pork, a bottle of the milk that Tage had milked from the cow that dawn, and a thick blanket that smelled musty but still provided warmth. He mounted Norden and rode to the shed. He left the basket by the door, knocked twice on the wood to let her know there was something there, and left without waiting for an answer. He did the same the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every morning before the sun, a basket by the door. Without saying anything, without asking anything, without expecting anything. And every morning, when he returned the next day, the basket was empty, washed, resting outside like a silent thank you that needed no words. Tage noticed. Tage always noticed. He showed up on the porch late one afternoon, took a sip of coffee, looked at the horizon, and said simply, "Who are you bringing food to, Herr Callie?" And Callie, who hadn't spoken about anything important in years, told him. He told him about the girl, the pregnancy, the shed, the "I don't want to." Tage listened to it all in silence with that expression of someone who already knows the answer before the question. After Callie spoke, Tage placed his cup on the edge of the porch and said, "Repairing other people's lives doesn't repair our own, Herr Callie, but sometimes it is the only path God leaves open for us to start over." 2 weeks passed in that silent routine. Callie woke before the sun, prepared the basket, rode to the shed, left it by the door, and returned. He never stayed to wait, never forced conversation, never even peeked through the crack in the door to see if she was all right. He did it with the same discipline with which he worked the earth, as if it were an obligation he had taken upon himself, needing neither explanations nor rewards. And every morning the basket returned, empty, clean, resting against the door as a mute word of gratitude that neither of them had the courage to turn into a voice. Norden already knew the way by heart. When Callie mounted in that direction, the horse walked on its own without the need for reins, as if it, too, understood that this route was now part of the order of things. Tage observed everything with that calm gaze of someone who reads the world without needing books. He asked no questions because he had already asked the only one that mattered, but from time to time he would toss phrases into the air, like someone throwing seeds into the soil and waiting to see what sprouts. One morning, he said the cow had given more milk than usual, as if she knew someone needed it. Another time, he said he had found some good tiles in storage, that anything could be repaired with them. Callie listened, took it in, and said nothing. But the following week, he showed up at the shed with the tiles tied to Norden's back, left them stacked outside next to the basket, and left. The next day, when he returned, the tiles were gone. He looked at the roof of the shed and saw that someone had tried to place a few over the largest holes. They were crooked, poorly wedged, the work of someone with neither the strength nor the practice for the trade. Callie looked at those crooked tiles and felt his chest tighten again, because there was a woman 7 months pregnant trying to repair a roof alone instead of accepting help, and he realized her wall was taller and thicker than he had imagined. It was Tage who gave him the idea without knowing he was giving it. On a cold afternoon, while repairing the fence of the enclosure, he said to the wind, as if Callie wasn't there listening, "A wild animal doesn't eat from anyone's hand on the first day. You leave the food, you walk away, and you come back the next day." Callie stopped what he was doing and looked at Tage for a long moment. Tage kept hammering the fence as if he hadn't said anything important, but he had said everything. The next morning, Callie changed the routine. Instead of leaving the basket and riding away, he left the basket, walked 20 paces away, and sat on a tree stump facing the shed. He didn't look at the door, didn't call out. He just sat there in silence with his hat in his lap, looking at the horizon as if he had all the time in the world and nowhere better to be. He stayed like that for almost an hour. When he stood up to leave, he saw from the corner of his eye that the shed door was cracked open. Someone had been watching him the whole time. The next day he did the same thing, and the day after, and the day after that. Always the same distance, always the same silence, always the same respect for that space she had created around herself like an invisible fence. On the fourth morning, when he had already been sitting there for 40 minutes, he heard a noise behind him. Light, careful footsteps, like an animal approaching, but yet undecided whether to stay or flee. He didn't turn around. He kept looking toward the horizon, his heart beating fast, but his body completely still. She sat on the ground about 5 paces away from him. She said nothing, neither did he. They both stayed there in silence, looking in the same direction, as if observing something that existed only between the sky and the earth. At that hour of the morning, the sun was rising slowly, the chill was beginning to fade, and some little birds, whose names Callie didn't know, were singing in a tree near the stream. After some time, which could have been 10 minutes or an hour, she spoke. She said her name, Selma, like someone offering a small coin to see if the other person gives change or steals it all. Callie nodded slowly and said he already knew his was Callie because he had said it the first day. And then they fell silent again because he understood that any further word could ruin what was being born there, something fragile, made of silence and presence that needed time to take root. Selma went back into the shed without adding anything else. But the next day, when Callie sat on the stump, when the silence was comfortable enough to fit a word in, she said the water in the stream was getting weak. She said it the way someone comments on the weather without asking for anything, without expecting anything. Callie said he could bring her water from the estate the next day. She didn't answer, but she didn't say she didn't want it either. And that silence, which was not a refusal, Callie understood as the first small piece of trust she was willing to grant. Days passed, and the ritual took shape. Callie brought the basket, sat on the stump. Selma came out of the shed, sat nearby, and they stayed there together without talking much. Sometimes he told stories about the land, about when it was time to plant, about how to read the clouds to know if snow or rain would come small. Safe things that asked for nothing in return and didn't invade any place she didn't want to open. Selma listened carefully and occasionally asked a short, practical question. Like someone learning to trust words before trusting the person. Callie never asked her where she came from, never asked her who the father of the child was. He never asked her why she was alone, because he knew deep in his heart that those questions were doors only she could open when she was ready, and that any attempt to force them would shut everything again, perhaps forever. What Callie didn't know, and what Selma carried inside her like a wound that wouldn't heal, was a story that began on an estate many leagues away. Selma had been raised by an aunt named Dagmar, the sister of her mother who had died in childbirth. The father she had never known. He was a faceless name no one in the family cared to remember. Moster Dagmar was a hard woman, not out of malice, but because life had been hard on her first, and she knew no other way to be. She raised Selma with the bare essentials: food on the table, clothes on her back, but without hugs, without affection, without any of the things that make a child realize they are loved. When Dagmar died of a cough that kept worsening until it took everything away, Selma was 17 years old and had no place in the world to call her own. That was how she ended up at the estate of Baron Ulf Krona, working in the kitchen, washing clothes, serving at the table, sleeping in a small back room that smelled of mildew and flooded when it rained hard. The Baron was a wealthy man with little soul, the kind who treated employees as if they were part of the furniture, and Selma quickly learned to be invisible, to lower her head, not to look him in the eyes, to do the work and disappear. It was a small, narrow life, but it was a life. And then Arvid appeared, the Baron's youngest son. Arvid was 25, with an easy smile and the kind of charm that men from rich families learn to use as a tool. He noticed Selma in a way that made her stomach turn, and he started seeking her out, leaving gifts in her small room, saying beautiful things to her when no one was listening. Selma wasn't foolish. She knew it was dangerous, but it was the first time in her life someone made her feel she existed, that she was seen, that she mattered. And when you've never received anything, even a crumb seems like a banquet. What came next was what always comes in these types of stories, and anyone who knows the world knows that many details aren't needed. Arvid sought her out. She gave in, and when her belly began to show, the easy smile vanished along with the beautiful words. Selma told him first, hoping that at least one of the promises whispered in those hidden meetings was true. Arvid turned pale. Then he got angry, and then he said the sentence Selma never forgot, that the child was not his, that she must have slept with others, that he wouldn't ruin his life over a servant who didn't know how to behave. The Baron found out the next day, not because Arvid told him, but because on the estates of rich people, secrets last shorter than dew in the sun. And the Baron didn't get angry at his son, he got angry at her. He ordered her to pack her things and disappear before evening, warning her that if she tried to spread stories about Arvid, he would make sure no one in the region gave her work or shelter. Selma left with the same bundle of clothes she had when she arrived, her belly already visible, and nowhere to go. It was weeks of walking. She slept on the sides of roads, in abandoned chapels, in whatever place offered a roof and a little protection against the night's dampness. She ate what she found: wild berries, pieces of bread that pious people gave her when they saw a pregnant girl walking down the road looking like someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. Her body ached, her feet bled, and fear was a constant companion walking by her side like a shadow that didn't disappear even at night. Fear of losing the child, fear of not finding shelter, fear of men, of any man, because the only one who had told her he loved her was the same one who had thrown her out onto the street. When she found the abandoned shed on Callie's lands, she was at the end of everything she could endure. She walked in, lay down on the dirt floor, and cried until she fell asleep. And when she woke up, she decided that was the place she would stay, even if it was the last place in the world, because at least there no one gave her orders and no one could expel her again. Callie knew none of this, but he sensed it. He sensed it in the way she flinched when he made a sudden movement. He sensed it in that gaze that measured his every gesture as if expecting a blow. He sensed it in the way she held her belly, always with two hands, as if the whole world were a threat and only she could protect that child. And every time he sensed these things, he thought of Viola. He thought of how he had failed to protect his daughter, and something inside him began to ignite, little by little, like an ember the wind blows softly until it becomes a flame. One morning, when almost a month had passed since that ritual of baskets and silences began, Callie arrived at the shed and found Selma sitting outside, leaning against the wall. Her face was pale, paler than usual, and she was holding her belly with an expression he knew, one that anyone who has ever seen a pregnant woman in pain knows. He dismounted Norden quickly and approached, but stopped before getting too close, because even in that moment, his respect for her invisible fence was greater than the urgency. He asked if she was feeling something, if the baby was moving, if she needed help. Selma said she had been having cramps since dawn, that the pain came and went, and that she was afraid. The word came out of her as if it had been torn out by force, because Selma was not the type to admit fear, not in front of anyone, and certainly not in front of a man. But the pain was greater than her pride, and the fear of losing that child was greater than any wall. Callie acted like someone who knows certain situations don't allow for hesitation. He said he had to take her to the estate, that there was a bed there was hot water. There were the conditions to take care of her properly, and before she could say, "I don't want to," he added that he would bring her back to the shed as soon as she felt better, that he wouldn't hold anyone prisoner, that it was only until the pain passed. Selma looked at him for a long time with those eyes that weighed, measured, and judged. And then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that to Callie weighed as if the whole world had shifted. He helped her onto Norden. It was the first time he touched her, holding her arm carefully, like someone grasping fine porcelain. And he felt the tremor that ran through her body when his hand met her skin. It wasn't cold, it was fear. Fear of contact, fear of closeness, fear of trusting the touch of another human being after everything she had been through. Callie led Norden by the reins, walking slowly alongside the horse, taking almost an hour to cover the road he usually rode in 20 minutes, because every sudden step could hurt her, and he wasn't going to let that girl feel more pain than she was already feeling. When they arrived at the estate, Tage was on the porch. He looked at Selma on the horse, looked at Callie leading the reins on foot, and didn't say a word. He went inside and prepared the guest room down the hall, far from Callie's room, because Tage understood enough about people to know that the girl needed distance just as much as she needed shelter. Selma stayed at the estate for 3 days. For the first 2, she barely left the room. Callie left her food by the door, exactly as he did at the shed, and Tage prepared infusions he had learned from his mother, infusions of lemon balm and chamomile that helped calm the stomach and the spirit. The cramps passed on the 2nd day, and the midwife Signe, a lady who delivered babies in the region and whom Tage had ridden out to fetch, examined Selma and said the baby was fine, that he was strong, that the pains were just the body preparing itself, and that there was no reason to despair. Selma listened to it all in silence with her hand on her belly and her eyes downcast. But when the midwife Signe left the room, Callie heard a low, muffled cry through the door, and he knew that cry wasn't of pain, it was of relief. On the third day, Selma appeared on the porch early in the morning. Callie was there, drinking his coffee, looking at the courtyard where the chickens were pecking around. She sat at the other end of the porch, distant but there, and for the first time, she looked around the estate with eyes that were not fearful. They were curious. She saw the large manor house, the barn, the vegetable garden Tage tended in the back, the large golden chain tree that at that time of year was loaded with flowers and painted the earth gold. She said nothing about the golden chain tree, but she looked at it long enough for Callie to understand she found it beautiful. And he was almost on the verge of saying that that was where Ingrid was buried, but he swallowed the words because that was a burden that belonged to him and had no place in that morning that was unfolding. For the first time in a long time, almost lightly, Selma said she wanted to go back to the shed. Callie felt his chest tighten, but he nodded without arguing, because he had promised he wouldn't hold her prisoner, and he was a man of his word. He took her back on Norden, slowly like the first time. And when she dismounted at the door of the shed, she turned to him and said something that branded itself into him like hot iron on leather. She said, "You are different." She didn't explain different from what. She didn't need to. Callie understood she meant different from every man she had ever known. And that was simultaneously the greatest compliment and the greatest sadness someone could receive. He took off his hat, nodded, and returned to the estate. That night, for the first time, Callie opened the drawer where he kept the paper and ink. He looked at them for a long time. He didn't write anything, but he didn't close the drawer either. And down at the shed, on that same night, Selma lay on the blanket he had brought her weeks earlier. She felt the baby kick hard against the palm of her hand and thought that maybe, just maybe, not all men in the world were the same. It was a small, fragile thought, like the sprout of a plant in dry soil, but it was there. And sometimes that is all God asks to begin changing a story. The weeks that followed were made of small steps forward that, seen from afar, seemed like almost nothing, but for those living them, they were enormous. Selma stayed in the shed because it was the place where she felt in control, where no one gave her orders and where the door was hers to open or close whenever she wanted. But Callie's estate became a constant presence in her routine, like the sun that rises every day in the same corner of the sky. She went there every 2 or 3 days, always on foot, always slowly because of the belly that now weighed too much, and stayed on the porch for a few hours. She didn't go into the house, she stayed outside, sitting on that wooden bench Tage had placed there, seemingly casually, but exactly in the right spot so she could rest and watch the courtyard without feeling trapped between 4 walls. Tage was the first to truly break the ice, not because he tried, but because Tage had that gift of simple people that makes things happen without forcing them. One day, when Selma was sitting on the porch and Callie had gone to check the cattle in the high pasture, Tage showed up with 2 cups of coffee and offered her one without saying anything other than, "It's freshly made." Selma accepted, and they sat there in silence drinking coffee until Tage pointed to a cloud on the horizon and said that cloud looked like it was bringing heavy rain, that they should take in the laundry before noon. Selma looked at the cloud and said she didn't think so, that the cloud was heading the other way. Tage looked at her with a new respect on his face and said that could be, that a pregnant woman sometimes guessed these things better than any almanac. Selma almost smiled. It didn't quite become a smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched in a way Tage noticed and saved to tell Callie later, because that was a victory worth recording. Selma's belly grew with every passing day. She was already in her 8th month, and the baby moved with a force that sometimes frightened her. Firm kicks that she felt on her ribs, on her sides, in places that seemed impossible to reach for a being so small. The midwife, Signa, came by every week to check on her. She palpated her belly with hands that knew exactly what to look for, rested her ear, and listened to the baby's heart, and then said everything was fine, that the baby was strong, that he would be born big. Selma always asked how she knew it was a boy, and the midwife Signe always answered the same thing, that a pointed belly is a boy and a round belly is a girl. And that belly there was the most pointed she had seen in recent times. Selma didn't believe in these things, but she didn't argue either, because there was comfort in that certainty of an old woman who knew about births the way Callie knew about land. It was during one of these visits that the midwife Signe took Callie aside and spoke to him in a low voice, with that tone women use when they want to say something serious without scaring anyone. She said Selma was doing well, that the baby was doing well, but that the girl was too thin for how advanced the pregnancy was, that her ankles were swollen in a way that could be a problem, and that she needed to eat better, rest more, and, above all, stop walking so much between the shed and the estate under the biting cold with that enormous belly. Callie listened to everything in silence. And then he spent the rest of the day thinking about what to do, because he knew that offering her again to come live at the estate could sound like pressure, and pressure was the last thing that girl needed. Once again, it was Tage who solved the matter without solving it. The next day, when Selma showed up on the porch, Tage was painting the door of the guest room, the same one where she had stayed during the cramps. Selma asked him what he was doing, and Tage replied without looking at her that he was fixing up the room because there was leftover paint and a closed room rots. Then he added, like someone commenting on the weather. Selma didn't answer, but that night, when Calla went to bring the basket to the shed towards late afternoon, he found the bundle of Selma's clothes tied and ready near the door. She was sitting outside with her hand on her belly, and when he arrived, she simply said she would accept the room, but that it was for the baby, not for herself. Callie took off his hat and said he understood, and inside he felt something he hadn't felt for far too long, something warm, akin to a purpose, akin to the feeling that perhaps life still had some meaning in store for him. Selma settled into the guest room with the same wariness of a cat entering a new house, spending weeks sleeping with one eye open. In the first few days, she barely left the room. She ate in there, slept in there, and when she had to use the outhouse or fetch water, she walked through the house hugging the walls as if wanting to occupy the least amount of space possible. Callie let her find her rhythm. He didn't knock on the door, didn't seek conversation, didn't do anything that could seem like an invasion. He left the food on a tray in the hallway, and when he returned, the tray was empty, always wiped clean, just like in the days of the shed. Tage acted the same way, keeping his distance, but making sure everything worked, that the firewood for the stove was chopped, that the water was fresh, that the house had that smell of coffee and cooked food that makes any place feel safer. What changed things was a rainy night, the first heavy storm of the season, the kind that arrives with fierce winds and lightning, making the entire earth shake. Selma woke with a start to a clap of thunder that rattled the walls, and when she sat up in bed, she heard a noise coming from the kitchen. She got up slowly, her heart pounding with that old fear that never entirely went away, and walked to the bedroom door, opened it a crack, and peeked out. Callie was in the kitchen, his back turned, preparing something over the fire. He hadn't heard her open the door. He didn't know he was being watched. He was making warm milk with pieces of bread. He stirred the pot with a wooden spoon slowly, with the attention of someone doing an important task, occasionally lifting the spoon to check the consistency. The light of the petrol lamp cast shadows on his face, and Selma noticed something she hadn't noticed before. Callie was tired. Not the tiredness of someone who has worked too much in a single day, but the tiredness of someone who has carried too much weight for too long. He had dark circles under his eyes, slouched shoulders, and there was a sadness in him that wasn't new, it was ancient, deeply rooted as if it were part of the structure of his body just as much as his bones. He turned around and saw Selma in the crack of the door. The two looked at each other for a moment, and Callie neither apologized nor gave explanations. He lifted the pot and said he had made warm milk with bread because the rain was heavy, and nights with heavy rain called for a warm meal. Selma left the room and sat at the kitchen table. It was the first time she sat at that table, the first time she was in a room of the house that wasn't the guest room. Callie set a bowl in front of her and one for himself, and the two ate in silence while the rain beat against the roof with a force that seemed to want to tear everything down. But the roof held, because Callie had repaired every iron sheet, reinforced every beam, sealed every crack, and that house, however sad it was as solid as the pain that supported it. After the meal, Selma did not return to her room. She stayed in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around the warm cup, watching the rain through the window. And then, without Callie asking her anything, she began to speak. She told him everything. She told him about Aunt Dagmar, the Baron's estate, Arvid and his lies, the expulsion, the weeks on the road. She spoke in a low voice, without apparent emotion, like someone telling a story that happened to another person, because that was the only way she could manage to say those things without crumbling. Callie listened to every word without interrupting, without making pitying faces, without trying to fix things with pretty phrases. He just listened. With that total attention of someone who understands that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a person is simply being there in silence, welcoming the weight the other person needs to unburden. When Selma finished, the silence became heavy between the two of them, but it was a different weight. It was the weight of something that had been carried for too long and was finally on the ground. Callie looked at her and told her he was very sorry. Just a few words, without frills, without speeches, without promises, just that. And Selma, who hadn't cried in front of anyone for months, felt her eyes burn. She didn't cry because the wall was still high, but her eyes burned, and Callie saw it. And that burning in her eyes hurt him more than anything else he had felt in years. After that night, Selma changed, not suddenly, not entirely, but she changed in the way the earth changes after the first rain. Slowly, from the inside out, she began leaving the room earlier, began helping in the kitchen, even though Callie told her there was no need, that she had to rest. But Selma had the pride of someone who refuses to live off favors without giving anything in return. And cooking was something she knew how to do well, because the years in the Baron's kitchen had been good for at least that. Her food was different from Callie and Tage's. It had flavors they didn't know. She had a way of mixing simple ingredients that transformed root vegetables and pork into a meal that made you close your eyes and give thanks. Tage, after the first lunch Selma cooked, looked at Callie with a gaze that said more than any word and merely stated that the kitchen of that house would never be the same again. And then there was the porch. The porch where Ingrid had put flowers and which had subsequently stood bare for years. Selma began to put things there without asking permission. First, it was a pot with some chives she brought from the field. Then it was an embroidered cloth she had made from scraps Tage had gotten for her. Then it was an arrangement of dry branches with wildflowers she gathered on the short walks she still took near the house. Callie watched each of those things appear and said nothing, but he felt each one as if it were a gentle hand brushing a layer of dust off something he thought dead, but which was only asleep. It was during this time that Callie began to do something in secret. Every night, after Selma went to sleep and Tage went back to his quarters, Callie went to the hallway of the house and stood before the locked door, the door to Viola's room. He stayed there for a few minutes with his hand on the handle, feeling the cold metal against his palm, and then returned to his room without opening it. He did this for a whole week. On the 8th night, he turned the key. The door opened with the creak of something that hadn't moved in a long time, and the air that drifted out was still old, smelling of dust and the past. Callie stepped inside and stood in the dark for a while before lighting the petrol lamp. When the dim light illuminated the room, he saw that everything was exactly as he had left it. The wooden crib he had built with his own hands when Ingrid was pregnant with Viola, the lace curtain at the window yellowed by time, a rag doll on a small chair, little girl's clothes folded on a shelf, everything frozen in time, like a photograph of a life that had ceased to exist. Callie sat on the edge of the crib and cried. He cried in a way he hadn't cried since the day Viola left, a deep weeping that came from the place where he kept hidden everything he couldn't bear to feel. He cried for the daughter he hadn't known how to love as he should have. He cried for the wife lost too soon. He cried for himself, for all those wasted years closing doors and drawers and pretending the pain would go away if he simply didn't look at it. When the crying passed, he sat there for a long time looking at the crib, and then an idea was born in him, not as a quick thought, but as a seed that had been sprouting for some time and had finally broken through the earth. The next morning, Callie asked Tage to go to the village to get lime wash and white paint. Tage looked at him, he glanced toward the locked door, and understood everything without needing a word. He went and returned the same day, and that night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Callie began to work. He cleaned the room from top to bottom, dusted the walls, washed the floor, opened the window to let fresh air in, took Viola's clothes from the shelf, and folded them carefully, placing them in a trunk he set in a corner. He kept the lace curtain because Ingrid had made it, and it was too beautiful to be locked in a trunk. And the crib. He sanded the crib, repaired the parts time had weakened, and painted it again with the same white paint Ingrid had chosen so many years before. He worked every night for a week. Tage would show up after dinner and help without asking questions, holding the lamp while Callie painted, passing him tools when asked, and occasionally dropping one of those sentences of his that seemed simple but carried the weight of the world. On one of those nights he said, "You are not fixing up a room, Herr Callie, you are fixing up a life." And Callie stopped painting for a moment. He looked at Tage and nodded, because that was exactly how it was. Selma knew nothing. The door to the room remained closed during the day, and Callie only worked when she was asleep. But the truth is, she was noticing other things. She noticed that Callie was different, lighter, as if a weight he carried on his shoulders had diminished a little. She noticed that he looked at her belly with a gaze that was no longer just concern. It was something else, something she couldn't name, but that made her chest warm up in a way that frightened her. And she noticed that the way he took off his hat when he approached her, that old gesture of respect, had acquired something new, a sweetness that wasn't there at the beginning, as if the gesture had ceased to be mere politeness and had become affection. On an afternoon, when the sun was already low and the sky had that burnt orange color that only the countryside knows how to paint, Selma was on the porch when she saw dust on the road. 2 men on horseback coming toward the estate. Her entire body froze. Even before seeing their faces, even before hearing their voices, she knew it. She knew it with that instinct of someone who has been hunted and recognizes the sound of the hunters before their arrival. She got up from the bench with difficulty, heavy with the weight of her belly, and hurried inside the house. Holding her belly with both hands, Callie was by the barn, and he too saw the dust. He saw Selma hurry into the house. He saw the fear in her body, because fear has a shape, a way of changing how a person moves, and he had seen that shape far too many times not to recognize it. The 2 men stopped at the estate's fence. They were large men with black caps, mounted on well-kept horses that didn't belong to poor folk. One of them asked loudly if this was the estate of Herr Callie Schoberg. Callie approached the fence unhurriedly, with that gait of an owner who knows every inch of his land and isn't intimidated by unwelcome visits. He said it was him. The man explained he came on behalf of Baron Ulf Legenkrona, who had information about a girl who had worked on the Baron's estate and who might be in that area, and that the Baron wanted to resolve the situation discreetly. The word discreetly left the man's mouth carrying the weight of a threat that needed no uttering to be understood. Callie listened to everything with a closed face, without moving a muscle. Then he looked at the man speaking, looked at the other who sat silently in the saddle, and said that on his property, the one who resolved things was him, and that any situation that needed resolving would be resolved by him, on his terms, in his own time. He said he knew no baron and that he didn't make commitments to those who sent messages through emissaries instead of showing up in person. He added in a voice that wasn't loud, but sliced the air like a blade, that if those 2 riders weren't off his property before the sun touched the horizon, they would find out that a lonely farmer doesn't mean a tame farmer. The men looked at each other. There was something in Callie's gaze that wasn't bravado, it was certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from someone who has nothing left to lose and who, precisely for that reason, is dangerous. The one who had spoken pulled the horse's reins, spat on the ground, and said the Baron would hear about this. Callie replied that he could send the whole Baron if he wanted to, that he would be waiting for him. The 2 rode off along the same dusty road they had come from, and Callie stood leaning against the fence until they completely disappeared over the horizon. When he went inside, he found Selma in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trembling. Her face was wet with tears she couldn't hold back, and she was holding her belly so tightly her knuckles were white. She said with a broken voice that she would leave, that she didn't want to cause him problems, that the Baron's people were dangerous, and she wasn't worth the trouble that would follow. Callie stopped in front of her, took off his hat as he always did, and looked at her with a gaze that contained everything. The pain of losing Ingrid, the guilt of letting Viola go, the years of loneliness, and that new thing that had been born in his chest, and which he could no longer deny. He told her she wasn't going anywhere. He said that house was big and strong, that it had been built to protect whoever was inside, and he said the Baron could send as many men as he wanted, that none of them would touch her or the child as long as he had blood in his veins. Selma looked at him for a time that seemed to hold a whole lifetime, and then she asked in a voice so thin it almost got lost in the silence of the hallway, "Why do you do all this?" And Callie knew the answer. He had known it for a while, but hadn't found the moment to say it until now. He took her hand carefully, the way one holds something sacred, and led her down the hall to the door that had been locked for years. He opened the door and lit the lamp. Selma saw the room. She saw the clean walls painted white, the lace curtain at the window, the sanded and varnished wooden crib with a small linen sheet inside that Tage had sewn with his large hands. She saw and she understood that this wasn't just any room. It was a room that had already housed a child, that had already guarded a father's dreams, and that was now there, open, renewed, waiting. Callie spoke. He said that room had belonged to his daughter, Viola. That Viola had gone away years ago and that he hadn't fought to keep her with him. He said he had locked that room because he couldn't bear to look at the empty crib and remember everything he had done wrong. He said he had spent years hiding behind work, silence, and solitude because it was easier than facing the truth of having failed as a father. And then he looked at the crib, looked at Selma's belly, and said the words that changed everything. I didn't know how to be a father to my daughter. I failed her in an unforgivable way. But this child that is arriving, he must not be born without a father. He must not grow up thinking that no one in the world wanted to stay. Callie squeezed her hand and his voice trembled, but it didn't fail. If you allow it, I can be the father. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but because I want to. Because looking at you and this child has made me feel something again that I thought was dead inside me. Selma couldn't speak. The tears came with a force she couldn't control, a weeping that came from the depths of that place where she had kept locked up everything she had swallowed since the day Arvid threw her onto the street. She cried out of fear, out of relief, out of anger for everything she had suffered, and for a new thing that was being born there, in that room smelling of fresh paint and second chances. Callie didn't hug her because he knew it wasn't the time yet. He just stood there, holding her hand, letting her cry out everything she needed to. And when the crying subsided and Selma lifted her wet face and looked at him, Callie saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't total trust, not yet, but it was the door of the wall opening truly for the first time. The days that followed that night in Viola's room were different from all the rest. Not because anything grandiose had changed outside. The estate was still the same, the cold was still the same. Tage kept tossing his phrases into the air like someone sewing without haste. But inside, in the parts no one sees, something had shifted. Selma stopped moving around the house, hugging the walls. She started sitting on the chair in the kitchen in the morning next to Callie, drinking coffee as the sun came up and the little birds made that racket only known in the countryside. They didn't talk much because neither of them was the type to talk too much, but the silence between them had changed quality. Before, it was the silence of two strangers sharing a roof. Now, it was the silence of two people who know things about each other and have chosen to stay anyway. Callie noticed these small things changing. He noticed that Selma had moved the chive's pot closer to the kitchen door where it caught the morning sun. He noticed that she had swept the porch without anyone asking her to, and that she had placed a bowl of fresh water so Norden could drink. When he returned from the pasture, he noticed she was humming softly when she thought no one was listening. A wordless melody that rose and fell like a breeze passing over the grass, and that sound made the house seem less empty in a way not even the flowers on the porch could achieve. And he noticed that when he took off his hat near her, her eyes no longer had that flash of fear, but something else, something warm that he didn't dare give a name to, because naming things is the first step to getting attached, and Callie was still afraid of getting attached. The Baron's threat didn't present itself again in the form of men on horseback, but it lingered in the air like a dark cloud that you don't know whether it will pour down or pass by. Callie, who wasn't a man to wait for problems sitting down, took measures in his own way. He went to the village, talked to people he knew, explained the situation without giving too many details, because in the countryside, the word of an honest farmer still holds a certain value. He returned with the certainty that if the Baron's men showed up again, they wouldn't find just him. The neighbors he hadn't greeted in years had told him they would keep their eyes open, that a watched road is a safe road, and that a Baron who sends his thugs onto others' lands isn't a Baron who deserves respect. Tage, when he found out, merely said it was about time Callie remembered he didn't live on an island, and that a good neighbor is like a good fence. It only works if someone takes care of it. Selma learned of the preparations without anyone telling her, because a woman who has lived in danger learns to read the signs, and all the signs were there. The hunting rifle appeared hanging on the living room wall, cleaned and loaded. The large, alert dog Tage, brought from a neighboring farm, which slept on the porch and woke at the slightest suspicious noise. The way Callie had started locking the estate's gate at night, something he had never done before, Selma saw all this and understood that this man was preparing for a fight that wasn't his, for a woman who wasn't his, for a child who wasn't his. And this realization was what finally brought down the last piece of the wall that she still held up. On an afternoon, when the cold had given a brief respite and a fresh breeze blew from the hills, Selma left the house and walked toward the large golden chain tree. Callie saw her from the kitchen window and felt his whole body stiffen because she didn't know what lay beneath that tree. When he got close to her, she was standing there, hands on her belly, looking at the yellow flowers that covered the grass like a carpet of gold. She said it was the most beautiful tree she had ever seen, that it looked like something planted by God with his own hands. Callie stayed silent for a moment, then he told her. He told her that Ingrid had planted that golden chain tree and that Ingrid was buried underneath it. He told her about the fever, the days spent trying to cure her, the night she passed away, the grave dug with his own hands. He recounted it all with a steady voice, without trembling, because he had already cried all there was to cry in that room weeks before. And what remained now was no longer raw pain, it was a sweet longing, the kind you learn to carry with you rather than on top of you. Selma listened to everything and said nothing for a while. Then she rested her hand on the trunk of the golden chain tree as if she were touching Ingrid herself and said his wife must have been a very good person to have planted something so beautiful. Callie felt his chest tighten in, that way he already knew, but this time the tightness came along with something else, something that was almost a relief, as if speaking about Ingrid near Selma under that golden chain tree had given permission for two parts of his life to exist in the same place without destroying each other. The baby was dropping. The midwife Signe, who came every week to examine her, said the little boy had engaged and could be born at any moment. She taught Selma to recognize the signs. She taught Callie what to do if the labor started before her arrival, and she left a bundle of clean cloths, sharp scissors, and instructions that Tage jotted down on a piece of paper with his crooked handwriting, because Tage was the type who believed important information should be written on paper and not kept in the head, because the head fails but paper remains. Callie prepared everything. He boiled water and kept it in covered pots, chopped extra firewood, washed sheets and folded them in the room with the crib. Every gesture was made with a care that went beyond practicality. It was the care of someone getting a second chance, and knowing that second chances do not bring thirds along with them. Selma noticed everything. She noticed the care, noticed the dedication, noticed the way Callie looked toward the crib every time he passed the room, with a gaze that blended past and future in a way she understood, because she too looked at her belly with the same mixture of fear and hope. And it was in one of these moments, on a quiet night when the two were on the porch and the sky was so laden with stars it seemed about to fall, that Selma did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took Callie's hand. She said nothing. She merely squeezed it with those thin fingers that had washed clothes, dug earth, and clung to the edges of roads. And Callie felt her touch as if it were fire and water at the same time, burning and soothing, destroying and building. They stayed there, holding hands in the dark, listening to the crickets and the breathing of the dog on the porch, and neither of them let go first. The labor came on a full moon night, when the whole world seemed bathed in a silvery light that cast long shadows across the estate's courtyard. Selma woke to a pain different from any she had felt before. A pain coming from deep down, gripping, releasing, and then gripping again with more force, as if her body had decided it was time, and no one was going to change that decision. She groaned loudly, a sound that pierced the walls of the house and woke Callie instantly. He rushed into her room, already holding the lamp, and when he saw her face, he knew. He had seen that face before, the night Viola was born. On Ingrid's face, that mixture of pain and determination only a woman in labor has, as if the entire body were fighting the oldest battle in the world. Tage went to fetch the midwife, Signe. He rode out into the dark with the haste of someone who knows labor waits for no one, and Callie stayed with Selma. He stayed to hold her hand as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. Selma squeezed his hand with a strength he didn't imagine she had, and between contractions, she looked at him with those eyes that no longer held fear. Eyes that no longer had barriers, that held only the naked truth of a woman bringing a life into the world and needing to know she was not alone. Callie spoke to her in a low voice, telling her he was there, that he wouldn't leave, that the baby was coming and would be strong and healthy. And every word of his was an anchor keeping Selma from getting lost in the pain. The midwife Signe arrived when the sky was just beginning to lighten on the horizon. She entered the room with the calm of someone who had brought dozens of babies into the world and knew that nature did most of the work. She examined Selma and said they were almost there, that the little boy was in a hurry to meet the world. Callie was about to leave the room because he believed it was the right thing to do, that this moment was for women only, but Selma squeezed his hand tightly and said the first thing she had said the entire dawn. She said, "Stay," just one word. But in that word was everything. There was the forgiveness she was granting to all the men who had disappointed her. There was the trust she had built brick by brick over those weeks. There was the certainty that this man here, this solitary farmer who took off his hat to speak to her and who had opened his daughter's room to welcome her son, was different from anyone she had ever known. Callie stayed. He stayed holding her hand while the midwife Signe worked, while Selma pushed with a strength that seemed to come from a place that wasn't just the body, but the soul. It was everything she had suffered and everything she hoped for and everything she wanted to give to that child arriving. The pain was immense, the effort superhuman, and Callie was there, as steadfast as the trunk of the golden chain tree, holding her hand without letting go for a second, whispering words that weren't pretty or refined, but as simple as the water in a stream, yet reaching exactly where they needed to reach. The baby was born when the first ray of sun came through the bedroom window. He came into the world with a loud cry, a cry that filled the entire house, making the dog on the porch prick up its ears and causing Tage, waiting outside with his hat in his hand, to close his eyes and silently thank God. The midwife Signe lifted the newborn, cleaned him, cut the cord, and placed him on Selma's chest. The baby was small but strong. He had his eyes closed, his fists clenched, and that wrinkled little face, typical of newborns, that is simultaneously the strangest and most beautiful thing that exists. Selma looked at her son and cried. Not from pain, not from fear, not from sadness. She cried the way one cries when life, after having beaten you down so much, finally delivers something that makes enduring it all worthwhile. The midwife Signe looked at Callie, who stood beside the bed, his face wet with tears he hadn't even realized were falling. The old midwife smiled and asked, as she asked at every birth she attended, if that was the father. Callie looked at Selma, Selma looked at him, and in that gaze an entire conversation took place that needed no words. Callie said yes. He said it with a broken voice, with a full chest, with the certainty of someone who knows that being a father is not a matter of blood, it is a matter of choice. It is being there, it is holding the hand when the pain comes and not letting go when the pain leaves. The midwife Signe nodded and said the child was lucky because a father who cries at the moment of birth is a father who truly loves. Selma held the baby out to Callie. He hesitated for a moment. The last time he had held a newborn was when Viola was born, and that memory surfaced with all its force, all its sweetness, and all its pain, but he took the baby. He held him in those large, calloused hands that knew how to handle hose and reins, and that now supported the lightest and heaviest thing in the world. The baby settled into his arms, as if knowing he was safe there, and Callie felt something break inside his chest, not out of pain, but out of life, as if a dam that had been holding everything back had finally given way, and what had been stuck began to flow once more. Tage tiptoed into the room, looked at the baby in Callie's arms, looked at Selma in the bed, and for the first and only time in his life, he had no phrase to toss into the air. He merely took off his hat, crossed himself, and stood there with tear-filled eyes. The baby was named Theodore. Selma chose it. She said it meant gift of God, and that she couldn't think of a more fitting name for a creature who had arrived in the midst of such a great storm and who, despite everything, was born healthy, intact, with strong lungs and a cry that made the house feel alive again. Callie said it was a beautiful name and that the child would honor it, because a son born strong in a difficult land grows up to become a person who doesn't retreat in the face of anything. The weeks that followed were ones of learning, of poorly slept nights, of diapers changed with clumsy hands, of cries where no one knew if they were from hunger, cramps, or simply a desire to be heard. Callie was present for all of it. He woke up in the middle of the night when Theodore cried, brought him to Selma to nurse, and then kept pacing the house with the boy in his arms until sleep returned. Tage cooked hearty broths for Selma to regain her strength. The midwife Signe dropped by from time to see if all was well, and every time she left, saying she had never seen a baby cared for with so much attention. And then one evening, when Theodore was sleeping in Viola's crib with that heavy sleep of newborns that seems impossible for the whole world to disturb, Callie did what he should have done years earlier. He went to the kitchen drawer, took out the paper and ink Tage had left there so many times, sat at the table, and wrote. He wrote to Viola. Not a long letter, not a letter full of elaborate excuses. He wrote the way he did everything in life, directly, heart in hand, and truth at the tip of the pen. He wrote that he missed her every day, that he had been wrong, that he knew he had been wrong, and that he lacked the courage to ask for forgiveness because he didn't believe he deserved it. He told her that a girl had appeared at the estate, pregnant and alone, and that he had done for her what he should have done for Viola. He said he now had a baby boy, Theodore, and that every time he looked at the crib where Viola had slept and saw Theodore sleeping in the same place, he felt life was offering him a chance to be better, and that he would grab that chance with both hands, even if they trembled. And finally, he wrote that if one day she wanted to return, the door was open, as it always had been, and that the golden chain tree her mother had planted continued to bloom every year, as if Ingrid were there, ensuring the beauty didn't leave with her. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and the next morning handed it to Tage to take to the village to mail. Tage took the envelope, looked at Callie, and simply said, "It took a while, but it arrived." And he walked away with the envelope in his vest pocket and a smile he made no effort to hide. Months passed, and the estate was reborn in a way Callie no longer thought possible. Selma took care of the house, the vegetable garden, Theodore, and Callie, even if she didn't admit the latter out loud. Callie worked the land with an energy Tage said he hadn't seen in him since the days of old Schuberg. The livestock fattened, the harvest grew, the porch was filled with new flowers, and the sound of Theodore's laughter, the laughter of a child that is the purest thing on the face of the earth, filled every corner of that house which had remained empty for far too long. Selma and Callie were married on a Sunday morning in the small parish church, without pomp, without elegant invitations, without anything that wasn't essential. She wore a simple white dress that the midwife Signe had helped her sew. He wore his usual clean white cotton shirt and brown vest, but without his hat, because that day he wanted his face to be completely uncovered, hiding nothing. Tage was the witness and held Theodore in his arms throughout the entire ceremony with the skill of someone who had carried calves all his life and who deep down didn't consider a human cub all that different. The priest blessed the union, the small community applauded. And when Callie kissed Selma, a simple, prolonged kiss that tasted of a new beginning, Tage whispered to Theodore, who was sleeping unaware of everything. "You see, little boy, this is what happens when you don't give up." Over time, that house became even fuller. 2 years after the wedding, Svea was born. A little girl with light eyes who was the spitting image of Callie and who cried with the same energy her father had for working the land. And later came Alvar, the youngest, a boy as quiet as his father and as observant as his mother, who from an early age followed Tage around the barn as if the old man were the most interesting person in the world. Theodore grew up never knowing that Callie wasn't his blood father, because in that house no one made distinctions. Callie loved all three with the same intensity, with the same care, with the same devotion of someone who knows that every child is an opportunity to repair what life has taken from him. Viola's letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. 3 months after the wedding, Tage brought it from the village along with the week's supplies and handed it to Callie on the porch without saying a word. He knew it was a sacred moment and that words would only disrupt it. Callie looked at the envelope for a long time, his hands trembling in a way he couldn't control. Selma appeared at the kitchen door with Theodore in her arms, saw Callie's face, and understood. She sat next to him on the bench and rested her hand on his knee, because sometimes you don't need words, you just need to know someone is close by. Callie opened the letter. Viola's handwriting was thin, delicate, different from anything he knew, and he realized his daughter had grown up, that she had become a person he didn't know, with her own handwriting, her own way of expressing herself, an entire life he had missed. Viola wrote that she had received his letter and had cried reading it. She wrote that she had felt anger toward him for a long time, the anger of children who don't understand why a father let them go without fighting. But over time, that anger had transformed into something else, into a longing mixed with a question that had never found an answer. And now, reading his words, the question finally had its answer. She wrote that she wanted to meet Theodore, that she wanted to see the estate again, that she wanted to see her mother's golden chain tree, and that she wanted to see her father again, if he still wished to be seen by her. Callie couldn't finish reading it the first time. He had to stop, breathe, let the tears flow, and then resume. Selma stayed by his side the whole time with Theodore asleep in her arms. And when Callie was done and lifted his face, she saw something in him she hadn't seen before. She saw peace. Not the peace of someone who has resolved everything, because not everything gets resolved, but the peace of someone who has finally stopped running from his own life and accepted that making mistakes is part of the journey, and that being able to start over is a right God gives to everyone, even those who believe they don't deserve it. Callie folded the letter, kept it in the breast pocket of his vest close to his heart, and looked at Selma and Theodore. He looked at the estate around him, the porch with the flowers, the courtyard where the dog slept in the sun, the great golden chain tree shining in the distance like a promise kept every year. And he understood that life isn't made of the things we plan, it is made of what appears along the road the moment we stop planning. A pregnant girl in an abandoned shed, a baby born on a full moon night, a letter arriving on a Thursday afternoon, a second chance no one asked for but that God delivered anyway, because God is so stubborn in his goodness, insistent in his hope, and patient with his children who take so long to understand they deserve to be loved. Tage appeared on the porch late that afternoon. He drank his coffee, observed the horizon where the sun was already setting, and said the last sentence that needed to be said, "This estate has been quiet for too long, Herr Callie. Now even the wind passing through these parts seems to be smiling." And it was exactly like that. Anyone passing on the dirt road at that moment would have seen a large stone and timber house with a blooming porch, a man in a brown vest sitting on a bench holding his youngest son, a young woman by his side resting her head on his shoulder, a little boy happily running across the courtyard, and a little girl hanging onto the arm of a thin old man sipping coffee in a corner. They would have thought they were seeing a family that had always been there, that things had always been that way. They would never have imagined that each of them had arrived there broken, alone, dragging stones that seemed too heavy for anyone's shoulders. They would never have known that that house had remained empty for years, that that crib had been locked behind a sealed door, that that woman had slept on the edges of the road, and that that man had wept in solitude under a golden chain tree more times than he could count. They would have known none of this. And perhaps it was better that way, because what mattered wasn't where they started, but where they had arrived now. And now they were there together. Sometimes life doesn't offer us a second chance under the same circumstances. Sometimes it offers us something completely different. An unknown woman, a forgotten old shed, a crib kept in the dark behind a door one lacked the courage to open. And it is in that difference that redemption dwells. Callie had not traveled back in time, he had not erased the mistakes made with Viola, nor brought Ingrid back to life, but he had learned that forgiveness is not found by fixing the past, it is found by having the courage to build something new in the present, even if your hands tremble and your heart is full of scars. If this story has moved you, leave your like, share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is always possible, and tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? The next story is already on its way.